Here is a massively expanded retelling of the story. Hey everyone! Before we dive into one of the most shocking mysteries to ever come out of the Ozarks, do me a favor. Hit that subscribe button and smash the like button. This story is so wild, so twisted, and so unbelievable that you won't want to miss a single second. I promise you, by the end, you'll be questioning everything you thought you knew about faith, betrayal, and the secrets people bury. Now, let's get into it. The year was 1977. In a sleepy, tight-knit town nestled deep in the Ozark Mountains of Arkansas, a beloved black pastor vanished as if he had never existed. No goodbye letters, no late-night phone calls, no witnesses, just nothing. The man who had led his congregation with passion and fire, who had baptized countless souls in the name of the Lord, simply evaporated into thin air, leaving behind nothing but a hollowed-out church, a heartbroken teenage son, and a community that whispered his name in hushed, frightened tones for decades. For 25 long years, the mystery festered. It became the kind of story people told around campfires, the kind that spawned ghost stories and conspiracy theories. What happened to Reverend Elijah Freeman? Did he run away with another woman? Did he abandon his faith and start a new life somewhere? Or, the most painful thought of all, had he taken his own life, crushed by the weight of grief after losing his wife just a year earlier? These were the shadows that haunted his son, Marcus, driving him away from the church and into a life of quiet, bitter emptiness. That is, until 2002, when a logger working in a remote section of the forest made a discovery that would tear open wounds that had barely healed. Hidden beneath an ancient tree stump, wrapped in decaying fabric, was a secret that was never meant to be found. A secret that would lead a grieving son back to the scene of a horrific crime and into a confrontation with the men of God who had become men of blood. We begin our story in the early hours of a chilly Friday morning. Marcus Freeman, now 42 years old, sat alone in his sparse apartment. The tick of the clock on the wall was the only sound, punctuated occasionally by the low, tinny static of the television. He was channel surfing, not really watching, just using the flickering light to keep the ghosts of the past at bay. It was that dead zone of the morning, where the air is cold and the soul feels heavy. He stopped on a religious broadcast. A preacher was speaking passionately, his voice echoing through an empty cathedral. Stained glass windows glowed behind him like 1,000 colored eyes. For a moment, Marcus was transported back in time. He could smell the old wood polish of Mount Olive Missionary Baptist Church. He could hear his father, Reverend Elijah Freeman, speaking about redemption and grace. A bitter ache settled deep in Marcus's chest. It had been a quarter of a century, but the pain was as fresh as the day his father vanished. A silence that had hollowed out his spirit and turned him away from God forever. Just as he reached for the remote to turn the painful memory off, the phone rang. The shrill sound shattered the morning silence. Frowning, Marcus walked into the kitchen and picked it up. "Mr. Freeman? This is Detective Sarah Miller from the Polk County Sheriff's Office." Marcus froze. The name meant nothing to him, but the context sent a jolt of electricity down his spine. "Detective? Is this some kind of joke? My father's case has been cold for 25 years. I understand your skepticism, Mr. Freeman," the calm voice replied, "but I assure you, this is not a prank." Early this morning, a logging crew working in a deep section of the National Forest, about 15 miles outside of town, unearthed a vintage Adidas bag buried beneath a tree stump. Inside, we found a pastoral robe and a worn Bible with the name Reverend Elijah Freeman written in the front cover. Marcus gripped the receiver so hard his knuckles turned white. His heart was jackhammering against his ribs. A Bible? With his name? "Yes, sir. We need you to come to the location to identify the items. I'm sending a patrol car to your residence now. Can you be ready?" Marcus barely managed to whisper, "I'll be ready." He hung up and stood in the kitchen for a long moment, staring at the wall. 25 years of buried grief, 25 years of anger at God, 25 years of wondering if his father had just walked away from him. All of it came rushing to the surface. He quickly changed his clothes, his hands trembling as he buttoned his shirt. As he walked through the living room, the televangelist was still preaching. He turned it off with a decisive click, feeling a strange sense of guilt, as if he was betraying his father by even looking at it. When the police car arrived, Marcus followed the officers into the cruiser. The drive was mostly silent, broken only by the crackle of the police radio. As they drove deeper into the forest, the pavement gave way to gravel, and the gravel gave way to dirt. The trees grew thicker, blocking out the early morning sun. Marcus stared out the window, wondering how in the world his father's belongings had ended up so far away from civilization. Why would the man who raised him, a dedicated servant of the Lord, travel this deep into the wilderness just to bury a bag? When they arrived at the scene, Marcus was stunned by the size of it. Yellow police tape cordoned off a massive area. Several forestry trucks and police cruisers were parked haphazardly along the narrow logging road. Forensics teams in white jumpsuits were photographing a massive, decaying tree stump in the center of the clearing. A woman in her early 50s with sharp, intelligent eyes and a professional haircut approached him. "Mr. Freeman? I'm Detective Miller. Thank you for coming." She gestured to a burly man standing nearby, his flannel shirt covered in dirt and sawdust. "This is Tom Jenkins. He's the logger who made the discovery." Tom had a kindly, weathered face. He extended a rough, calloused hand. "Sorry about the circumstances, son. I've been logging these woods for 30 years, and I've never seen anything like it. We were clearing this plot for new growth when I noticed something was off about this stump." He pointed to the massive, rotted stump. It had been hollowed out by decay on the bottom side. "I had a feeling, so I started digging by hand. Excavators can't get this deep into the forest, so it was a shovel and sweat." He continued, "About 2 feet down, my shovel hit something metal. It was the zipper of an old Adidas bag. When I pulled it out and saw the robe and the Bible, I knew I wasn't dealing with someone's trash. I called the sheriff immediately." Marcus approached the bag, which had been carefully placed on a folding table inside a forensic tent. He stared at the tree stump first, trying to process the logistics. "How does a bag get buried under a tree stump?" he asked. Tom scratched his beard. "Well, I've been thinking about that. Based on the growth rings, this tree was cut down a long time ago, maybe 30 or 40 years. Whoever buried this bag knew exactly what they were doing. They came out here after the tree was felled, possibly while the stump was still fresh, dug a hole underneath the roots and buried the bag. Then, as the stump rotted and the forest grew over it, it became invisible. If we hadn't been clearing this specific section, it could have stayed hidden for another 100 years. Detective Miller led Marcus into the tent. The officers inside were wearing gloves and surgical masks to preserve the ancient evidence. They carefully removed the contents. First came the Bible. It was water-damaged, the pages stuck together in a pulpy block, but the bag had protected it from complete destruction. In the top corner of the inside cover, Marcus saw his father's distinctive handwriting, Reverend Elijah Freeman, Anno Domini 1977. Tears welled in his eyes. "That's his handwriting," he whispered, his voice cracking. "He used to write my name in birthday cards exactly like that." One of the officers carefully turned to the last page of the Bible. A folded piece of paper, yellowed and brittle, was tucked inside. It appeared to be a daily prayer note. As Marcus read it, his throat tightened. The words were a desperate plea to God. "Why is there so much evil in this world? Why do wicked men try to pull me away from the gospel? I am suffering. I am alone. Please, Lord, give me the strength to win against the wolves who wear sheep's clothing." Marcus looked up, his expression a mixture of grief and confusion. "This doesn't sound like a man who ran away, Detective. This sounds like a man who was scared, a man who was threatened." Next, they examined the pastoral robe. It was stained with dirt and decay, but the stitching was intact. "We'll be sending this to the state lab for DNA testing," Detective Miller said. "If there's any trace of blood or tissue, we'll find it." 25 years ago, forensic science wasn't what it is today. We have tools now that can detect proteins and DNA signatures even on degraded fabric. Marcus ran his fingers over the collar of the robe. "The size is right. My father was a tall man, but slender. This was his." A troubling thought occurred to him. "Do you think someone did this to him? Killed him and hid the evidence?" The detective was cautious. "There's no visible blood spatter on the robe, Mr. Freeman. If this was a violent death, we might see evidence of laceration or blunt force trauma on the garment. But we won't know until the lab results come back." She paused, looking at the Adidas bag. "But I have to be honest with you. Your father was a black man in the Ozarks in the 1970s. Racial tensions were high. If he was removed by someone, the investigation back then may not have been as thorough as it should have been. The system failed a lot of people in those days. Marcus shook his head firmly. My father was no coward. He would never have taken his own life. And if he wanted to run away, why would he travel this deep into the forest to bury his identity? Why not just burn the robe? Tom Jenkins nodded. It took me 40 minutes of digging to get down to that bag. And I'm a strong man. That soil is heavy clay mixed with rock. Someone worked hard to hide this. They didn't want it found. Detective Miller took a deep breath. Mr. Freeman, we're going to reopen the case. We're going to review the old files, talk to the old investigators, and see if we can find out who in the community might have had a motive to hurt your father. As the police secured the evidence, Marcus asked if he could take photographs of the items. An officer explained that because it was an active investigation, they would provide him with official copies once processing was complete. Detective Miller then offered to have an officer drive him home. But Marcus didn't want to go home. The moment the squad car dropped him off, he headed straight for the spare room in his apartment, the room that had once been his father's study. When the family home was sold years ago, Marcus had kept everything from that room. The shelves, the desk, the old leather chair, and hundreds of sermon notebooks that his father had written by hand. He began to search the shelves. His father had been obsessively organized. Every sermon was dated, labeled, and filed meticulously. Marcus checked the section for 1977. It was there, but the volume for the year was missing. He looked for the 1977 personal diary, also missing. He searched the entire room, pulling boxes from the closet, checking the desk drawers. Nothing. He sat heavily on the edge of the bed. His father kept meticulous records. The only logical conclusion was that the 1977 materials weren't in the house. Maybe they had been kept at the church, Mount Olive Missionary Baptist Church. Marcus hadn't been inside that building in 25 years. The thought of walking through those doors made his stomach turn. But he knew he had to go. The drive to the church was short. The building looked much older now, the white paint peeling, the stained glass windows dusty. He sat in his car for a long time, staring at the steeple, remembering the sound of his father's voice echoing through the sanctuary. Finally, he drew a deep breath and walked inside. The interior was eerily the same. The wooden pews gleamed with polish. The red carpet was faded but clean. The pulpit stood at the front, commanding and dignified. An elderly man was standing near the altar, adjusting the hymnals. He turned and smiled warmly. "May I help you, son?" the man asked. "I hope so," Marcus replied. "I'm looking for someone who might have known my father, Reverend Elijah Freeman." The man's eyes widened with recognition. He introduced himself as Pastor Harold Whitmore. He was the main pastor of the church now, though he had worked alongside Elijah Freeman as a deacon back in the day. He stared at Marcus, his mind doing the math, and then his face transformed with joy. "Marcus? Little Marcus? My goodness, look at you. You've grown into a fine man." Pastor Harold called out to the back office. "Reverend George, come here. You won't believe who's standing in my sanctuary." An elderly man with silver hair walked out, wiping his hands on a rag. It was Reverend George Langston, another longtime deacon who had since been ordained as a minister. The two men were delighted to see him, but their joy was tinged with nervousness when Marcus explained about the discovery in the forest and the police theory that his father might have taken his own life. "I'm seeking the truth," Marcus said. "You both worked closely with my father. Did he seem troubled? Did he seem suicidal?" Pastor Harold and Reverend George exchanged an uncomfortable glance. "He was quiet," Harold said slowly. "After your mother passed, he spent long hours in his office. He prayed a lot. We figured it was just grief." "Actually," Reverend George added, "in the last few weeks before he vanished, he seemed almost paranoid. He kept asking about finances, about the church's books. We didn't think much of it. Just a man worried about the state of his flock." Marcus felt the hairs on his neck stand up. Finance. The church's books. His father had never cared about money. Why would he suddenly start auditing the church's accounts? "I'm looking for my father's 1977 sermon notebook and personal diary," Marcus said. showing them the older volume he had brought from home. "I have every other year, but these are missing. Do you know where they could be?" The two men shrugged. "We never saw them," Pastor Harold said. "If we did, we would have given them to the police back then." They offered to search the church. They checked the old office where Elijah had worked, now used by Reverend George. They searched the library, a small room lined with dusty books. They spent almost an hour looking through shelves and storage boxes. As they searched, Marcus placed his reference notebook on a table in the library. But the search yielded nothing. No trace of the missing 1977 volumes could be found. Defeated, Marcus knelt at one of the pews and whispered a quick, uncomfortable prayer. "God, if you're real, if you rose from the dead, please, just let me find out what happened to my dad." Then he stood up, thanked the men, and walked out. In his rush, he left his father's old sermon notebook behind on the library table, an oversight that would change everything. Instead of going home, Marcus turned his car toward the cemetery where his mother was buried. He stopped at a flower shop and bought a modest bouquet. The cemetery was quiet in the late afternoon, the rows of headstones shaded by ancient oak trees. He laid the flowers on his mother's grave and sat on the grass. "Hi, Mom," he said softly. "I'm sorry it's been so long." He told her about the discovery in the forest, about the Bible and the robe, about his suspicions. The conversation was one-sided, but it brought him comfort. As he sat there, he heard the sound of soft crying. It sounded like a little boy. He got up and walked toward the sound. He found a young boy, no older than 10, sitting against a tree a few rows away. His face was streaked with tears, his shoulders shaking. "Hey there," Marcus said gently. "Are you okay?" The boy looked up, sniffling.
"I'm Robbie."
"Where are your parents, Robbie?" Robbie pointed to a grave marker nearby. Marcus's heart sank. The boy had just lost one of his parents. He looked around for a guardian, but no one was there. "Can I take you home?" Marcus asked. "Please, not home," the boy whispered, his voice quivering. "They don't like me there. My aunt and uncle. They don't want me." The words struck a deep chord in Marcus. After his father disappeared, he had been sent to live with relatives who made it clear he was a burden. He understood this child's pain intimately. "I'll stay with you for a while," Marcus said. "But eventually we have to go. Your family will be looking for you." He reached out to comfort the boy, placing a hand on his shoulder. Immediately, he felt heat radiating through the child's thin jacket. "Robbie, you're burning up," Marcus said, alarmed. "You have a serious fever. I need to get you to a hospital." "Please, not the hospital," Robbie pleaded. "Can you take me to a church instead?" Marcus shook his head. "The hospital is safer." Robbie's face scrunched up with fear. "When my mom was alive, whenever I was sick, she would go to the pastor and get the take-home Holy Communion. She would give it to me and pray, and I would get better." Marcus's breath caught. He knew that ritual well. As a pastor's son, he had helped prepare those take-home communion sets for sick parishioners. It was a beautiful tradition. "If you agree to go to the hospital with me," Marcus said, "I will get you the Holy Communion. I'll bring it to you there and we'll take it together. How does that sound?" After a moment's hesitation, the boy nodded. As they walked to the car, Marcus suddenly realized he had left his father's notebook at the church. "I'll have to come back for it," he muttered. He drove Robbie to the emergency room and explained the situation to the medical team. He filled out the paperwork, agreeing to cover the cost of the visit if the boy's family couldn't be reached. As the nurses took Robbie back, the boy looked at him with wide eyes. "You promised about the communion." "I'll keep that promise," Marcus said. "I'll be back soon." He left the hospital and tried calling the church number. No one answered. He decided to drive back. When he arrived, the sanctuary was empty. He walked toward the library and found a young staff member, a kid in his early 20s, organizing a shelf. "Can I help you, sir?" the young man asked. "I'm looking for a notebook I left here earlier, and I need a take-home communion set for a sick boy in the hospital." The young man seemed helpful. "I can help with both. Let's check the library." They walked into the library, and Marcus was relieved to see his notebook still on the messy table where he had left it. He picked it up, noticing that the piles of books from their earlier search had been neatly returned to the shelves. He glanced around the room, his eyes scanning the top shelves. One book caught his attention. It was teetering dangerously close to the edge, as if it had been placed there hurriedly. The title on the spine read, Church Financial Management and Stewardship. "That book is about to fall," Marcus said, reaching up. The young staff member started to protest, saying he would get a step ladder, but Marcus was already stretching. He grasped the book, but it was unexpectedly heavy. It slipped from his fingers and fell to the floor with a loud thud, the pages splaying open. "I'm sorry," Marcus said, bending to pick it up. As he gathered the loose pages, he noticed something that made his blood run cold. In the margins, written in a distinctive script he knew better than his own, was his father's handwriting. "Is this book available to borrow?" Marcus asked, trying to keep his voice casual. The staff member looked uncertain. "We need to check it out properly." "Of course." After the young man recorded the loan, they walked toward the sacristy to get the communion. The staff member asked Marcus to wait in the hall while he retrieved the elements. "I'm sorry, but I can't let anyone into the sacristy until they have the proper training." "Understood," Marcus said, but his mind was already racing. He opened the financial book and began to flip through the pages. There were numerous passages highlighted and annotated in his father's handwriting. One section was particularly heavily marked. "God sees how we handle his money. This isn't just bookkeeping. It's about trust and integrity." In the margin, his father had written, "Accountability to God first, then to the congregation." But as Marcus turned the pages, he noticed something chilling. There were faint impressions of erased pencil marks. His father wrote with a heavy hand, leaving deep indentations in the paper. Tilting the page to catch the light, Marcus could make out two names that had been circled and then painstakingly erased, Harold Whitmore and George Langston. Both had question marks beside them. Several paragraphs about embezzlement and financial impropriety were underlined, with notes written in the margins, "Confront with grace," or "Bring before the congregation." Marcus closed the book, his hands shaking. His father had suspected the church deacons of stealing money. His father had planned to confront them, and 2 weeks later he vanished. He walked toward the window at the end of the hall. Through the glass, he could see into the cemetery. Two silhouettes were moving among the headstones. Even in the dim light, he recognized the hunched shoulders of Pastor Harold and the tall, thin frame of Reverend George. They were digging by a large oak tree at the far edge of the graveyard. A shovel glinted in the fading light. The staff member returned with the communion set. "Here you are, sir." "Thank you," Marcus said, accepting it. "Do you know what they're doing out there at this hour?" The staff member shrugged. "Just blessing the graves. They do that sometimes." Marcus didn't believe it. Blessing the graves wasn't a standard Baptist practice, and it certainly didn't require shovels. He walked outside, his legs moving quickly. He needed to see what they were doing. He approached the cemetery gate, staying in the shadows of the trees. As he got closer, he could see that they weren't just digging. They were filling a hole. Reverend George was shoveling soil onto a mound while Pastor Harold stood nearby, holding a plastic bag that looked heavy and full. "Good evening," Marcus called out, deliberately making his presence known. Both men jerked their heads up, their faces pale with shock. "Marcus," Pastor Harold's voice was too high, too strained. "We didn't expect to see you again so soon." "I came back for my notebook," Marcus said, watching them closely. "What are you doing out here?" Reverend George cleared his throat. "We were just blessing the graves, and we noticed this old grave marker for a deceased dog from the congregation. It was falling over, so we're just doing some maintenance." But Marcus saw the fresh soil, the size of the hole, the way they were sweating despite the cool evening air. And the plastic bag, it wasn't full of dog remains. It was too heavy for that. "I see," Marcus said, his voice flat. "Well, I should be going. I have a sick boy waiting for communion at the hospital." Pastor Harold's eyes darted toward the book under Marcus's arm. "Is that another book from the library?" Marcus nodded. "Yes, it fell from the top shelf. I noticed my father's handwriting inside, so I borrowed it." Reverend George's posture stiffened. "Your father was always digging through the books," he muttered. "Just remember to return it on Sunday." "Of course," Marcus said. "Good night." He walked back to his car, feeling their eyes boring into his back. Once he was inside, he didn't start the engine. He watched them through the rearview mirror. They were standing in the same spot, their heads close together, talking intensely. Marcus made a split-second decision. Instead of driving to the hospital, he waited. A few minutes later, Reverend George loaded the shovel and the plastic bag into the trunk of his car. He climbed into his vehicle and pulled away, exiting the cemetery from a back gate. Pastor Harold hurried back into the church through the rear door. Marcus followed the Reverend's car, keeping a safe distance. The car sped up, leaving the town limits and heading toward the mountain roads. Marcus recognized the area. It was the same direction as the forest where the Adidas bag had been found. He pulled out his phone and called Detective Miller. "Detective, it's Marcus Freeman. I'm following Reverend George Langston. He was digging in the church cemetery. I think he was trying to hide evidence." "Where are you now?" the detective asked, her voice sharp. "I'm on the old forestry road, heading toward the mountain lookout. He's got a shovel and a bag of something with him." "Don't approach him," Miller ordered. "I'm sending units your way. Keep your distance and keep me on the line." Marcus followed the Reverend's taillights as they wound up the narrow mountain road. Finally, the car pulled into a gravel parking area at Eagle Point Lookout. "He's stopping," Marcus whispered into the phone. "I'm pulling over about 100 yards back." He watched as Reverend George got out, put on a headlamp, and retrieved the plastic bag and shovel from the trunk. The old man walked toward the guardrail and descended a set of wooden steps toward a lower viewing platform. "I think he's going to throw something off the cliff," Marcus said, his heart racing. "I can't wait. I have to stop him." "Wait. Don't," the detective started, but Marcus was already out of the car. He ran toward the lookout, his flashlight bouncing over the dark ground. He descended the stairs, his footsteps echoing on the wood. "Reverend George," he called out. The old man spun around, his headlamp blinding Marcus. When the light shifted, Marcus could see the shock and rage on his face. "What are you doing here? Have you been following me?" "I saw you racing out of town," Marcus said, moving carefully along the trail. "I was worried about you. It's dangerous out here at night." The Reverend didn't answer. A heavy silence fell between them, broken only by the distant roar of the river far below. "You know, don't you?" Reverend George finally said, his voice low and tense. "Know what? Don't pretend," the old man snapped. The wail of police sirens cut through the night air. Reverend George's eyes widened in panic. "You called the police?" In his shock, the plastic bag dropped from his hand. It landed with a thud on the wooden planks, and something solid inside made a distinct noise, not soil, not cloth, but the hard crack of book covers. Before the Reverend could react, Marcus lunged forward and grabbed the bag. He looked inside. Buried beneath a thin layer of grave dirt were two books: his father's missing 1977 sermon notebook and his personal diary. "You hid these from me," Marcus shouted, his voice cracking with rage. "You were going to throw them away. And that wasn't dog remains in that hole, was it? That was my father." Reverend George backed away, his face ashen. "It wasn't supposed to be this way," he whispered. "It was supposed to be over." Detective Miller's voice echoed from the parking lot above. "Police, stay where you are." With a sudden, desperate movement, the Reverend climbed over the safety fence that separated the trail from the cliff edge. "No!" Marcus shouted, rushing forward. "Don't do this. This is better than facing the shame," the Reverend muttered, preparing to jump. Marcus grabbed for him, but his fingers closed on empty air. As Reverend George leaned into the void, two officers who had raced down the stairs lunged forward and caught his arms, pulling him back from the edge despite his struggles and his pleas to let him fall. "You'll face the judgment of the world first," one officer said as they dragged him back over the fence. The scene that unfolded over the next few hours was one of the most dramatic in the history of Polk County. Detective Miller radioed for backup to arrest Pastor Harold at the church. The elderly minister was found in his office, shredding documents, and was taken into custody without incident. Back at the police station, Marcus sat in a conference room, watching as forensic technicians carefully laid out the evidence. The two books, the grave soil, the shovel, and then the bone fragments. "We believe these are your father's remains," Detective Miller said gently. "They were buried in an unmarked grave in the church cemetery, beneath the roots of an old oak tree." The remains are badly degraded, but we've submitted samples for DNA testing. Marcus stared at the fragments, a wave of nausea washing over him. They buried him in the church cemetery, while they held funerals for other people above him. It seems so, Miller replied. The grave they interred him in was originally a pet's grave. They used the confusion around the pet burial to hide the fresh soil. The interrogation of Reverend George took hours, but eventually, the old man broke. He confessed to everything, his voice ragged and broken. In 1977, Elijah Freeman had discovered that the church's finances were being embezzled by the two deacons he trusted most, Harold Whitmore and George Langston. Over a period of 3 years, they had siphoned over $15,000 from the church's collection plate, falsifying records and hiding the thefts behind vague accounting terms. Elijah had confronted them privately, giving them a choice: confess their sin before the congregation and step down, or he would expose them himself. That Friday night, Elijah stayed late at the church to prepare his Sunday sermon. Harold and George confronted him in his office. The argument grew heated, and according to George's confession, Harold struck Elijah in the back of the head with a heavy brass candlestick. When he fell, they panicked. They dragged his body to the church basement, where they strangled him with a cord to make sure he was dead. They wrapped his body in an old robe from the sacristy and buried him in the cemetery under the cover of darkness. The following week, they prepared the vintage Adidas bag, placing Elijah's Bible and personal items inside. They paid a logger acquaintance to dig a hole under a tree stump in the deep forest, hiding the evidence where they hoped it would never be found. For 25 years, they maintained their innocence. They misdirected the police. They used their influence in the community to shut down any talk of murder. But the truth, as it always does, found a way to surface. As the sun rose over the Ozarks, Marcus drove to the hospital. Robbie was still in his room, his aunt and uncle sitting in plastic chairs beside his bed. "Mr. Freeman," the aunt said, standing up, "Robbie told us what you did. Thank you for bringing him here." Marcus nodded, pulling the communion set from his bag. "I made a promise." Even though he was not a pastor, even though his faith had been battered and broken, Marcus spoke the words of institution. He broke the bread and poured the juice. He gave a piece to Robbie, to his aunt, to his uncle, and took a piece for himself. As they took communion together in that quiet hospital room, Marcus felt something shift inside him. A weight lifting, a light returning after a quarter of a century of darkness. After they finished, Robbie looked at him curiously. "Will I see you again?" "I think so," Marcus replied. "Maybe you and your family can come to Mount Olive Baptist Church with me sometime. I have a feeling they might need some help there in the coming days." Robbie smiled weakly and reached out for a hug. "I want to be a kind man like you when I grow up," he whispered. As Marcus left the hospital later that night, he looked up at the star-filled sky and whispered a prayer, the first sincere prayer he had prayed in 25 years. He thanked God for the miracles he had seen. A forgotten notebook, a fallen book, a sick boy in a cemetery, and a logger who decided to dig. In the weeks that followed, the community of Mount Olive was rocked to its core. Harold Whitmore and George Langston were charged with first-degree murder, obstruction of justice, and embezzlement. They would spend the rest of their lives in prison. DNA testing confirmed that the bone fragments found in the cemetery were indeed the remains of Reverend Elijah Freeman. On a cool autumn morning, Marcus stood at the edge of a fresh grave in the town's public cemetery. A headstone had been erected, inscribed with his father's name, his dates, and the words, "A faithful servant who confronted evil with love." As the pastor gave the eulogy, Marcus closed his eyes and listened to the hymns. He was no longer angry at God. He had seen, in the most painful way possible, that God had never left his father, and that even in the depths of betrayal and murder, the truth would always find the light. "Rest in peace, Dad," Marcus whispered, placing a hand on the cold stone. "I finally know what happened, and I forgive them." It had taken 25 years, but the pastor who vanished into thin air was finally home.